Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. Today is a bit of an odd show, or at least odd episode of my show. I was bothered on over the weekend by the way the Paris Olympics opened, and I reached out to a friend of mine, Annie Crawford, to see if she was interested in joining me for a conversation, not just about the fact that Paris did something kind of crazy. That part I don't think either of us really shocked or surprised by, but particularly about the symbolic meaning of the 2024 Paris Olympics opening ceremony and the drag queen Last Supper tableau. Now, I'll freely confess, I'm something of a neophyte when it comes to symbolism, but Annie and I were at a couple of conferences together over in the last year, 2 years, something like that. And I realized she is really good at discussing symbolism. She loves Jonathan Pageau's show, The Symbolic World. And if I'm tracking your travels correctly, Anna, you made it to his Symbolic World conference earlier this year. Yep. So she's far better than I am about talking about the meaning of symbols. So today, we're going to have a conversation about symbolism, communication, and what's really going on in this particular moment in the Paris Olympics. And before we get into that, I want to just introduce a distinction. I've been thinking about this now for a grand total of 2 days. So definitely these are all very well thought out, clearly articulated points after 2 days of contemplation. But I keep running into friends who, when I tell them I'm bothered by this, they want to tell me that I should not be outraged. And I don't think that's the right word to describe this, because outrage communicates a sense of anger, shock, and surprise. I'm not angry at anyone in particular. I'm not really shocked, nor am I truly surprised. I want in some way for it to be legitimate to have a response to a cultural moment. And I think that's where our conversations really go to today. I think it's perfectly legitimate in what Aaron Renn calls the negative world for Christians to look at the world around us as the world is getting darker, as choices are being made, as ancient paganism sort of revived themselves. In those moments, it's perfectly legitimate for Christians to look around and say, this is not great. This is not what God intends. So I simply want to note changes. I want to be able to recognize what communication is happening, and I want to be alert. So one of my models for this really is Socrates. He went around Athens famously telling people, you don't know everything that you think you know. And of course, the Athenians hated this. Their response was kind of, well, Socrates, why would you be outraged that I think I know what piety is? Why do you care? Why do you think it's worth talking about? And Socrates almost never answered their question. He just kept asking them, so what exactly is piety, Euthyphro? And eventually they killed him for it. But I think Annie and I will both be a little bit Socratic today as we attempt to have a discussion about just what is going on in this particular moment. So enough of my intro. Annie, any responses to that intro before we get to our questions today?
Yeah, well, it's great to see you, Josh. And I'm looking forward to this conversation because I do think it's important. And I've had a similar response to you, observing, through social media, through the weekend, the past 4 days, everybody's responses to this global symbolic moment, right? A certain symbol of the good life was elevated for the whole world to see in this Olympic opening ceremonies. And it's been very interesting to see the various responses. And I, like you, have been a little bit, not surprised, not shocked, but found it interesting that many people see a Christian critique of the opening ceremonies as somehow being excessively offended or showing grievance, or whereas what I feel like is it's a very basic moral obligation to call what is evil evil and good what is good. That cultivating an appropriate response to evil and perversity is a basic function of a healthy culture, that we have a basic moral obligation to say, hey, this thing that was elevated on national TV across the whole globe, it symbolized and visualized perversity that is destructive to the common good, and that it's a right and good thing to point that out. And of course, we want to try and do that intelligently and clearly, and in a way that helps turn people back toward what is good and true and beautiful. But that critique is part of that process, and seems to me just a basic function of a healthy culture.
I agree 100%. And hopefully we are just able to contribute to that. Because one of the things that strikes me is like this is a moment that at least a lot of people are thinking about and talking about. The number of articles that have come out. I think you were on a podcast yesterday with somebody else discussing this. There's a lot of interest in this moment. So it clearly resonates. It clearly strikes people as somehow being significant. And I hope we can get into that today. Let's start with just a little bit of definitional work. Annie, what exactly is a symbol? I might remember that word from 11th grade literature class, but what on earth is a symbol, and why should we care about symbols?
Yeah, all right. Well, let's start with some basic etymology. So symbol is a word that comes from the Greek, and it means to cast together. And what is being cast together is a physical thing and a certain meaning. So the symbol cast together, connects together thing and meaning. Now, it's important to differentiate symbols from signs. And there is a lot of confusion on this, and it's kind of a personal area of study and a passion of mine to help clarify the difference between a symbol and a sign. In a symbol, the thing and the meaning are intrinsically connected. That the meaning of the symbol, it emerges from the thing's own inherent qualities. Okay, so a rose is a symbol of feminine beauty from time immemorial because that meaning emerges from the qualities of the rose itself. It is sweet. It is delicate. It unfolds to reveal a divine center. Those qualities are inherent in the rose, which allows it to function as a symbol in love poetry and in art. We'll see in the Olympic tableau, flowers are used as part of the symbolic composition of the tableau. So a rose will symbolize something in a way an onion never can, right? An onion, because of its inherent qualities, it's the thin skin that hides these fleshy layers, and there's no center. There's actually an emptiness inside the onion. Those are different qualities that communicate different meanings. And so in a symbol, the meaning, we're casting together a thing and a meaning, but that meaning is emerging from the intrinsic qualities of the thing. It's not arbitrarily constructed or projected. It emerges from the thing itself. Whereas a sign is more of what we're talking about in, Saussure and where you have a thing and then a meaning that is arbitrarily attached through a social construction. Okay. So for example, maybe street signs that direct traffic. I was recently in Scotland, had a great time, but it took me a while to learn what the traffic signs were communicating because, you had I can't even remember, like a blue circle and a red square. I don't even remember, but these certain sort of arbitrary features that meant don't park here. That's a sign because we're taking an image and then socially agreeing to connect a certain meaning to it that may or may not be that emerge from the intrinsic qualities of the thing. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful, the difference between a symbol and a sign, because in symbolism, the onion, the rose, the thing itself is going to carry meaning with it no matter what the intention of the artist is. Okay, you put a flower into your painting and that flower is going to bring with it the meaning that is intrinsic to the kind of thing it is, no matter what you're intending it to say or not. And I think that'll be important when we get to discussing, what was communicated through this Olympic opening ceremony tableau. And one last point to make, it is really interesting to note that the opposite of symbol in Greek is diabolical. Symbol means to bring together, right? To unite the worlds, to unite heaven and earth, meaning and matter. Diabolical means to cast apart, to tear apart heaven and earth, to tear asunder things and meaning. And I think that will also be an interesting term to note in our conversation.
Well, that's a really helpful beginning point. It reminds me of the book I've been reading the last couple of weeks. I've been working through Stratford Caldecott's book, Beauty for Truth's Sake. And I want to bring in 2 points from Caldecott to our conversation. He has this great line that's stuck with me now for a couple of weeks that he says, quote, "There is a Pythagorean sense of meaning at the root of Western civilization." And what he means by that, and what he builds from that, is this fundamental belief that theoretically, or at least legendarily, began with Pythagoras and then spread from him to his followers and from them into Western mathematics, that numbers are fundamentally meaningful. That 1 is a symbol of unity, 2 is a symbol of duality in this sense, that it communicates that inherently. 3 is a symbol of transcendence, of uniting the duality in something greater than all the parts. Now that there's that sense of meaning and trying to see the meaning behind the world, that belongs to Western civilization. One of his examples he gives is the tree, the world tree Yggdrasil from Norse mythology, where in Norse mythology, it is a literal tree. It does literally span 9 worlds that go from the top of the Aesir and the Vanir all the way down to Hell at the bottom. That's Hell with 1 L for anybody looking for the spelling. But at the same time, Yggdrasil is a symbol of unifying the different layers of reality. And so that sense, anytime Yggdrasil shows up, it communicates this sense of unity and the ability to move between these different layers. So I find fascinating the idea, there's in one sense, there's a sort of language that we have to learn to read. We don't automatically necessarily grasp everything that's going on in a symbol, which is one of the reasons I want to talk to you, because I think you'll see more going on here than I do, because you've looked at this a lot. Let's do one other definitional moment before we get into really the Paris Olympics. Any thoughts on what is blasphemy, and does the Last Supper tableau rise to the level of a blasphemous act?
Yeah, I'm going to procrastinate that question 1 second, because you bring up the language of symbolism. You also mentioned Jonathan Pageau, and I do want to recommend his brother's book, The Language of Creation. And that, this is part of what it is to have a sacramental view of the world, which is the same thing as a symbolic worldview. It means that God created the material world to be a manifestation of spiritual meaning. I mean, that is a Christian metaphysic that we believe, as Psalm 19 tells us, as Romans 1 tells us, that the heavens and earth were created to communicate meaning to us. And humanity has understood and spoken through that symbolic language, that language of creation, up till the modern era. We live in an era that is uniquely symbolically illiterate. Our ancestors, ancient and medieval, they could understand, they read the world through forms. Now, this is what Marshall McLuhan is trying to revive in his work on media, and with his axiom that the medium is the message, that the forms themselves carry and communicate values and meanings, and that those values and meanings that are being communicated through the forms are as powerful or more powerful, than the words were explicitly saying. So this symbolic language of creation is one that we moderns have lost. We're illiterate in terms of symbolism. And I think that's part of what makes this moment feel so poignant, is because even though we became unable to read the language of creation very well, and symbolism and art very well, still that meaning was present. Still that meaning has been working on us unconsciously. And here comes this kind of global movement of clear symbolic import, and you see people don't know how to read it. They don't. Is it just an allusion to this other painting? Is that where the meaning comes from? Or this inability to read the symbols. So to connect that to your question of is this blasphemy or not, I think we need to do a little bit more unpacking. in terms of, well, let's unpack the images, the symbols that are constructing this image in order to better identify what's going on first. And then, in terms of is it blasphemy or not, I haven't really thought about that word. So I would love to hear your thoughts on how you would define blasphemy, because that's not one I've really thought about or studied too in depth, actually.
Well, I can do that rather briefly. Blasphemy is honestly not that difficult, I don't think, to define. It's also not that hard to recognize. It's something that I'm going to give, but it's been years since I've formally studied this. So apologies to any theologians who might be tuning in or listen to this later. So please feel free to write me and correct my definition. But I would begin a definition of blasphemy with the intentional mocking of holy things. My favorite image, biblical moment of blasphemy occurs in the book of Daniel when grandson of King Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, he has the holy implements of the temple, the cups and bowls that are supposed to be used to raise offerings to the Most High God in sacred worship. He has those brought in, filled with wine, and has everybody drink to the gods of Babylon. And it's that moment that immediately precedes divine judgment on Belshazzar, when Cyrus the Great and the Persians invade Babylon. And that all happens there. But before then is the famous moment where a hand floats in the air and it writes the phrase, Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. You've been weighed. Your kingdom is found wanting. Tonight it will be ripped away from you. And it's a direct response. It's God's divine response to the king mocking holy things. Now, Jesus speaks to this a little bit in the New Testament when he says, the ones, and this is the reason I'm slightly caveating on my definition of blasphemy, because it's a matter of great debate in theological circles about whether or not unbelievers can commit this particular sin, or whether believers can commit this particular sin. Jesus says the only unforgivable sin is blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. Mm-hmm. But that's a particular subset of the overall blasphemy. So in religious history, blasphemy, and really in Western history, blasphemy has been a crime in the Western world for far longer, really even far longer than Christianity. In ancient Rome, this is the reason why Christians were widely persecuted, because they were thought to be blasphemous because they would not sacrifice to Caesar. And since the gods are the source of the law and the gods are the source of order, if you don't obey the gods, then you must be a deviant and we have to kill you, was kind of the general rationale. So there has been in Western culture this general assertion that whatever the gods are, the gods must be respected in some way, and to disrespect the gods is a great crime. Christianity codifies that and makes that more specific. Blasphemy is blasphemy against the God of the Bible, and so that's where this moment. Now, of course, it's 2024. I don't know of any Western nation that still actually cares about blasphemy laws. Like, this is no longer a legally prosecutable thing. I'm sure there's some county somewhere in England that still has ancient blasphemy laws on the books, but no one's going to win that court case. But it just struck me as very interesting that this moment seemed so inherently disrespectful to Christianity that it raises the question, like, is this actually not just mockery? Is it something beyond satire? Is it actually blasphemy at the point of just blatant, overt, unmissable disrespect? So that was maybe a bit long-winded, but that's at least what I have in the back of my head with that question. So Annie, walk us through the imagery that you see there in that moment.
Right. Okay. So, and I'm going to focus. I focus on the tableau, right? The Lord's Supper table, because there's other imagery going on in the opening ceremonies, But if we focus on the table, we begin with the symbol of a table, right? A table is the place where the community gathers to share a meal. And what is it to share a meal? It's literally to become one body, right? Because what I eat becomes digested and part of my body physically, right? So if we place a good roasted pig on that table, we all eat the roasted pig, we are all becoming one body. We're sharing in this one thing. And it's both physically, socially, spiritually, we're gathering around that which feeds us and gives us unity, right? That which gives us life and gives us unity. That's the symbolism of a table. and this is why can help you understand, let's say in Homer's Iliad, why it's such a big deal if you're thinking like an ancient person, for Achilles to eat with Priam, right? Enemies don't eat together because you're enemies. You don't share one bread. You don't share one table. You don't, there's not unity. Okay, so that's the symbolism of the table. And, that symbolism is an ancient part of all human cultures, right? Because that meaning emerges from simply the structure of who we are as humans. We need to eat. We are social animals. We sit down to eat, so inherent in simply the way that the world is created is this universal symbolism of a table, the place where we gather to share that which gives us unity and life. Okay, and as Christianity unfolds, right, Christ takes this universal symbol and gives it special significance, right? Here he says, again, drawing from all kinds of meaning that has been built up through the Old Testament, right, through the Exodus and the Passover, as well as through just the universal general meaning that comes from general revelation. But Christ gathers his people at that table and says, what is the food that will give you unity and eternal life? I am that food. I am the bread of life. I am the Passover sacrifice. I will give you divine resurrection life. And for all of Christendom, then, the image of the table has been caught up into the image of the Eucharist, right? And Christians for thousands of years in France, in the West, have understood what it is to gather around a table where we share one food, the eternal food of the life of Christ. Okay, that's our historical context in which the artists of the Olympic opening ceremony decide to depict their own table, right? Now here, important to symbolism is context, right? So it's not just that a rose have meaning, but where you place the rose in the context of the whole is how the meaning is built, right? Okay, so the Olympic opening ceremonies, what is the context? The Olympics are at the height of global culture. What is it that we all share as humans on this earth? I mean, what? Not that much, right? I don't know many people who care about the UN. I think the Olympics would be the apex, the highest thing that we share as a world culture. So that's the context in which these symbols are being placed, right? And so what would be the purpose, the telos of the opening ceremonies of the Olympics? Well, what is the purpose of the Olympics? It's a place where we all gather to celebrate excellence in being human, right? We have these God-given human capacities to run, to jump, to move. We have athletes who have trained those God-given capacities to the height of their skill. We all gather to watch and celebrate human excellence. Okay, so the opening ceremonies should be showing us images of that which gathers us together. They should be showing us in their own particular French or German or Chinese style, but they should be showing us pictures of human excellence because that is what has gathered us together on the Olympic stage. Okay, so here at this highest position of global culture, a place where the purpose should be to show us human excellence, what is lifted up? This tableau. So kind of, the context in order to interpret your meaning, right? Okay, we have a table. And the table is where we gather around to be fed with that which gives us life and unity. And what, you have this big moment where the silver platter reveals the thing that will, here are the nations of the world gathered at the table. What's going to feed us and give us life and unity? Okay, and it's a blue Baccus. It's a blue Baccus. Okay, so we need to kind of, and then there's the disciples of Baccus gathered around, which we can get to in a minute. But let's kind of unpack. Blue is an ancient symbol of divinity, of transcendence. Blue dyes were expensive, so it's a color associated with the sky, with the heavens. C.S. Lewis says, is not the sky a myth? From time immemorial, the blue sky symbolizes to us heavens, divinity, that which is above. Okay, so blue Baccus, blue, he's divinized by being blue. Okay, he's fat. Okay, he's got a fat little tubby. I mean, not super fat, but he's got a belly, right? So that symbolizes, gluttony. He's self-indulgent. And then he has flowers, images of female genitalia, and then his own genitals dangling in a clearly visible blue pouch. Okay, so, and then he's Baccus, he's Dionysus. He is the god known for drunken orgies. So what is being offered to us on this table of unity? Self-indulgent gluttony and sex, right? That's what's being presented to us on this tableau as the thing that binds us and gives us unity. And it's really just, simple demonic divination of the self and appetites. Placed in a context where so instead of, in the West, at the Lord's Supper, we would gather around the table to be fed a sacred holiness. And instead, in a mockery and a satire, we're being gathered around the table to be offered gluttonous self-indulgence. And what, no matter what the artists, whether they intended to imitate this particular painting in history or this particular painting in history, is completely irrelevant, because that's not how art works. That's not how symbolism works. Art works through these symbolic structures, echo each other across, right, an aesthetic tradition. And so it's really beside the point to be arguing. And I think, on your Facebook post, you made the clear point. They called it le scène, the word for the Lord's Supper in French, right? So, and the actress herself, I think she said it was her gay New Testament.
Yep.
Right. So
there's no subtlety in that sense. I mean, there's no attempt for the people involved in this to pretend it's anything but a depiction of the Last Supper, the Last Supper.
Right. So, you also have, I mean, there's echoes of Eden. Okay. So that we have the fruit and the flowers, always these images of paradise echo for us a lost Eden. Okay. And then you have the song. I don't know if you've seen the lyrics to the song.
I have.
Yeah, and so he's singing, would there be wars if we had stayed totally naked? Where to hide a revolver when you're totally naked? I know what you're thinking, but it's not a good idea. Okay, so this is crass. First of all, it's just crass. I don't know what you're thinking, but it's not a good idea. No more wealthy, no more poor when we all go back to being naked. Okay, so here's this communist revolutionary trope where it's by stripping everybody of what makes them unique that we're going to return to an Eden, right? We're going to equalize everyone by stripping away anything that makes them different, and that will return us to the naked bliss of Eden, right? Whether you're slim or fat, we're all totally naked, live like we're born naked. And so this too is a more subtle diabolical aesthetic, right? Because what is the essence of the diabolical? It is better to rule in hell than reign in heaven, right? It is self-will, grasping, taking for the self. This is the essence of the fallen Eden, right? You can have the knowledge of good and evil. You can be like gods, just take and eat. Grasp for yourself life, right? And so that is the imagery here. Self-indulgence, images of Eden, lyrics that tell you to just grasp Eden and take it for yourself, right? With overtones of these revolutionary tropes included. On top of all that, then you have the gathering of the disciples, the queer disciples.
Let me jump in real quick before we go to the disciples, because I hopefully our listeners have all noticed this, but I just want to highlight the fact that you spent about 7 minutes describing the symbolic meaning of this without mentioning a word about queer, lesbian Jesus. And I think there's something significant there, that the reason this provokes such a response. I mean, like, I don't think Bishop Robert Barron's video saying this was really bad went viral because anyone on the planet is shocked that Christians don't like the idea of a lesbian portraying Jesus. Like, no one's surprised by that. But there's something so fundamentally different happening in what you just described. Is the Christian vision of the Lord's Supper is a moment where ultimate Messiah is here. He has just washed the disciples' feet. He has given the ultimate image of servanthood. And he has said, as I have done to you, so you must go and do to others. This is now how you're going to mark leadership amongst you, by loving one another. It's taking that, and it's taking this right sense of submission, where we as the creatures ought to submit to this God who is dying to win us back to himself. And all he requires in our submission is just recognizing that we're not him. That's it. That's the only requirement. We just have to recognize that we are fallen humanity, and that he is better and greater than we will ever be. And that's all it takes to come to him. Replacing that with this vision of, I'm sure I got your wording right, gluttony, self-indulgent gluttony and sex as our unifying things. That is ultimately unsatisfying at such a fundamental level. And I think I would like to say every adult eventually realizes that those things are ultimately unsatisfying. And we all know that, even if we currently pretend that gluttony and self-indulgent hedonism will actually give us true joy and meaning. And I wonder if that's really the symbolic communication. If you're right, that meaning is happening, that meaning is going forth, and people understand it at some level, even if it's not quite cognitive, propositional. I can articulate what it was meant by that. They see that, and they realize that's ultimately false. And I think particularly Christians realize that's false. But I wonder if that's in part why there was such a global response to really condemning this particular moment.
Right. There's such a density of subversive meaning going on that I think you're right. Even if we've kind of lost the ability to read symbols, let's say consciously, still there's a lot that we pick up intuitively, and this kind of intuitive response of wait a second, we've become used to, a image of a bearded woman. Unfortunately, it's not just that. It's the synergy of so much meaning that is gathered into the image of a table. And you think about it, the Eucharist is an image of the cross, right? I think that artists know they couldn't have gotten away with putting a sexualized Baccus, Dionysus, on a cross. Okay, but people who understand Eucharistic imagery know this is basically the same thing, right? Because when we gather for Eucharist, when we gather for the body and blood of our Lord and Savior, that body and blood was poured out for us on the cross and given to us at the table, right? And so the table is the same. There's the same meaning as the cross, but it's the joyful side of that symbol, right? So I think you're right, and that there's people are picking up on a lot of intuitively of what's going on.
Well, walk us through the disciples of Blue Baccus. I like Blue Baccus as a name, as an aside. I think Baccus there is better than Dionysus. Blue Baccus. So who are the disciples of Blue Baccus? Who's showing up on stage or at the table here?
Yeah. Now, I will admit to not paying as much attention to this because I have a visceral response to this imagery, and I don't want to look at it too long, right? And so it's enough to see, a highly sexualized, bearded trans woman, a non-binary or kind of effeminate guy in gender-neutral Speedos with his testicle hanging out, a child. These are just perverse images that a healthy person doesn't want to look at. So I have not gone and counted or analyzed much of that symbolic structure beyond what to me was just obvious, that what you have is a gathering of the queer right? You have a gathering of those who represent the deconstruction of norms, right? So particularly the bearded man, woman, is it man, is it woman? What we're doing is it's an image that intends to break gender norms. By putting a child there, you're breaking age norms, right? You don't take children to orgies. Okay, so putting a child there is breaking that age norm, which is, something that is highly disturbing, and that not just Christians, healthy people of any kind should step up in public discourse and say, hey, what's evil is evil and what's good is good, because that's how, again, just to return to our first point, that's not being offended and it's not pearl clutching. It is our moral obligation for the well-being of society to help train our, that the people in our culture are trained in right responses to what is good and beautiful and what is perverse and destructive. So, the only other symbolic point I had to offer about the tableau is just, to say what we have elevated to the highest place is this self-devouring sexual appetite. Self-centered, devouring sexual appetite. And I think I saw you post something about saying this is not the France of Saint Denis. So people probably don't know, but Saint Denis is the patron saint of Paris. And Saint Denis was beheaded as a martyr. And Saint Denis, his name is related to Dionysus. So there's something very interesting going on there, where you have the rejection of Saint Denis, who founded Paris within Christendom, and his replacement of Saint Dionysus. There's something odd going on there. But as what's elevated to the center is this image of sexual indulgence. You said it's a Foucaultian France, right? And what Foucault articulated explicitly and represents is sex as our source of transcendence, sex as our religion. Foucault said sex is the key to who we are. It's the explanation for everything. Sex is worth dying for. Sex is more important than our own soul. So I do think that is part of why this is so important, is that here in this highest point of global culture, these artists really dared to push on the world this postmodern sex as religion ideology that we already know they're trying to work into global culture, right? By attaching, global food aid to your acceptance of transgender ideology. So it's really, I see it as this moment that is on the front lines of where the cosmic war is playing out.
Well, that cosmic war is a temptation to divert our entire conversation over to C.S. Lewis and the Cosmic Trilogy, but I'm going to resist that temptation. We might have to come back and do a whole other conversation about that hideous strength or Paralandra one day. I just want to offer a couple of things I observed as I was paying, because I went kind of the opposite approach that you did. I focused less on the table imagery and just a little bit more on the disciples. So I'll at least add these thoughts in.
Oh, great.
I was struck by the lack of unity in their own portrayal, because if you go and look at Da Vinci's Last Supper, he very clearly arranges the disciples in 4 groups of 3. And they're just that's very typical Renaissance numerical sources of creating unity. You've got 4 groups of 3. The 3 are all usually looking at each other, or they're all looking the same way. In contrast, when you get to the tableau at the Olympics, they're not all looking away from the Jesus figure. They're not all looking towards her. Instead, most of them are looking out at us, the audience, and they want to draw our attention to themselves. So there's not even a unified center of the tableau itself that you can clearly track by the direction the people are looking. which seems to me to already be a helpful way of grasping just how really meaningless the term queer is as a group noun, because you're attempting to label a group of people who all define themselves by rejecting the norms that define them as human beings in different ways. And we saw that on display. Men, women, child, trans, bisexual, whatever. They're all queer in radically different ways. So there's no real sense of unity there. I did think it was also very interesting that there was a lack of parallelism in the arrangement of the spectacle, because in the original Last Supper, you have a very clear 6 disciples on one side, 6 disciples on the other, Jesus in the middle. If you go and look at the other painting we need to talk about here in a moment, the Feast of the Gods, there are 12 figures total at the table, which is 12, not 13, so there's not a center point. But what you get instead you get some figures who are bringing food to the table. So there's a soldier standing on the other side of the table. It doesn't have the same linear unity that both the Tableau and Da Vinci's painting had. In this Tableau, you don't have a parallel arrangement. There are, I didn't bring my notes with me, but it's 5 on one side, 4 on the other side, and then Jesus Lady in the middle. So it's not even a sense of like, oh, well, let's at least arrange this with the same number, which I thought was very interesting. The other thing, I want to read a paragraph from Joy Pullman's essay. She published a write-up about this moment in yesterday's Federalist. She brings up a really interesting part about the hand motions that each of these figures have. Here's how Joy puts it. The Last Supper Blasphemy display was thematically and metaphorically interesting in many other ways. A Renaissance art expert noted to the New York Times that the sex performers made voguing poses. Voguing is a dance that originated among queer people. It also, Bach says in a 2017 explainer, has a violent undertone. It's an extension of throwing shade. Instead of fighting, 2 people would settle their beef on the dance floor. These sex performers in Paris attacked a central Christian theme using a dance that to them connotes social war. It's super interesting that in an era in which Christians and their institutions are tempted to accommodate what God calls sinful, queer activists regularly reinforce the Bible's position that queer sex is an act of aggression against God. Even when trying to be anti-Christian, these activists reinforce Christianity's message. Joy hits on a lot of things in that essay. I thought she did a very good job pointing out that even the ability to mock Christian teaching actually, ironically, and to God be the glory, it's caused millions of people around the world to start searching for what exactly is the Last Supper? Who is this Jesus guy that's being mocked? And that's a great byproduct. But I also think it's worth noting that even in their voguing poses, if this art critic is correct, there is an attempt to clearly be at war against traditional sexual mores and sexual morality. The other thing, last thing I noted, this may be relatively basic, but I think it's at least worth noting. And this part I don't want to hang a whole lot on. It may be more accidental than anything, but I do think it's worth at least noting that this is staged outside as opposed to the indoor setting for Da Vinci's Last Supper. And the outdoor staging is going to connect this a bit more with nature than an indoor setting, which connects this more to civilization. So we have a nature-themed bacchanalia orgy that is happening outdoors. We're not going to stage that inside a room with lamps or candles that are going to connote all the soft living of civilization. So I think the disciples of Blue Bacchus, all in various ways, are attacking the norms that allow human beings to live together peacefully. I don't think it's possible in today's age to overstate the importance that the important connection between civilization, living together peacefully, and raising children. If we are thinking about a world without children, it's far easier to think about a world where drunken orgies could happen in meadows or in parks out in the open. If we are thinking about a world in which all of us want to raise our children, even though if those are hypothetical children in the future, we don't want a world where there are drunken bacchanalias happening in the park. Yeah. So this is a fundamentally anti-human, anti-child celebration in a very real way, which in my opinion at least makes this a very anti-civilizational moment. So in the extent, so if you're right and the Olympics is the high point of global civilization, This really is. It's one of the. It's like that the Shakespeare line about once you untune hierarchy and distinction, you unravel all of civilization, and all that's left, Shakespeare says, is appetite and universal wolf. So here you have the universal appetite devouring itself, because in a world where we're all ruled by self-indulgence, gluttony, and sex, ultimately there's nothing really unifying us except whoever is most powerful and can force others to comply. And that's not a world that is civilized. That is the ultimate barbarism, that civilization exists to be better than.
Yeah, all that's so good. And really, in terms of my concern, at the top of my mind is the way that the West, America and Western Europe, is exporting this toxic ideology onto other countries, right? So again, when people online are like, you're just having offense and you're such a thin-skinned Christian. No, I am concerned about the destructive ideology that we are not only ruining our own children with, but exporting onto the rest of the world. I think that's a case of what you might call justice, a desire to use whatever power and influence we have to elevate what is good and true and beautiful, not what is, destructive. And I think, you were right on with the idiosyncratic imagery, right? Because an ideology of the self is everybody broken down into their idiosyncratic preferences, right? And you're very much right of how that, that's a well-established principle of totalitarianism, as you isolate everybody into their individual idiosyncrasies, and then you have to have the strong man who comes and forces share.
Oh.
Sorry about I think my internet broke there. Sorry about that.
Oh, there we go. Well, I'm going to jump in real quick with a comment, because I had a thought there that you mentioned earlier, the diabolic imagination as an imagination that is fracturing things and breaking them apart, ripping heaven asunder, in that like heavenly war imagery from Milton kind of idea. In a very real sense, like I think this was a diabolic image, because the truly it's Lewis does this so well in the Screwtape Letters. I mean, the true devilish temptation or the true demonic act is not to replace a bad thing or a good thing with a bad thing. Most of us, when we are honest with ourselves and truly rational, we know that we don't actually want the bad thing. And we know the bad thing is going to lead to pain and sorrow. But if we can just divert the good to a slightly different thing, or if we can take something that is actually pernicious and horrible for us, and if we can put that in the place of the good, and then use all the energy that we have within us that says we should want the good, and if we can change the object towards which those desires are directed, that's a profound change. And if Saint Peter is correct that the enemy prowls around like a lion looking for whom he can devour, this is a moment where I think you and I, but certainly the Paris Olympic Committee approved, designed, and funded a picture of unity around the ultimate division of humanity into all these different parts. So we truly do, in that sense, I think, have a diabolic image here in a place where everyone expected a symbol of international unity.
Yeah, I think so, right? And St. Augustine says, what is sin? What is the nature of evil and sin? It is the inward curvature of the soul onto itself. Right? Mm-hmm. So that humans, all of creation is made to be aimed towards God. He is the highest good, the source of being and beauty and light. And all his creatures are made to be aimed toward him. And what is the nature of sin? It's to take the desires of the heart, the aim of the heart, and turn it in on itself. Right? That is the nature of evil and sin. That again is the diabolical, better to rule in hell. Right? Better to have self-rule, ownership of myself, than to serve in heaven. And this is a diabolical image because it is an image of the idiosyncratic self indulging the appetite. I mean, you don't get a lot more diabolic than that, especially when you put that in the context of what ought to be one of the most sacred images of the Eucharist, right? And I think that, what Joy was talking about in that Great Federalist essay, I hope everyone goes and read it. You very much feel like, we'll get a little bit of that hideous strength in here, right? You feel like Mark in that hideous strength, where the totalitarian system is trying to force you inside, right? You're being indoctrinated into this totalitarian system. And what is one of their key mechanisms? Well, they force you into this initiation room where all the artwork is surrealist, meaning that it's all just
such a great scene,
off a little bit, right? It's exactly what you're talking about with the disciples not being quite symmetrical, not being quite right. And the purpose of that surrealist art where things are just a little off, they're a little uncanny, they're a little disorienting, is to slowly break down your sense of the norm, of normalness, right? So that if we break down your sense of what is normal, if you can't tell good from evil, you can't tell man from woman, you can't tell demon from angel, you can't tell beauty from ugliness, then you can't rule yourself at all, right? And you're complete putty in the hands of who would just push you where they will. And, to Pullman's interesting point, though, is in order to this is the irony, this is the catastrophic turn, okay? Is that in order to fully break you of your sense of the normal, they have to desecrate the sacred, right? So Mark, they insist that.
I don't want to interrupt this time because you were in the middle of a great point.
Yeah, I don't know what's wrong with my internet, but hopefully it's, that the height of Mark's training, the height of his surrealist training is to desecrate the cross, right? And because if you're going to break everything, you've got to break the highest and most sacred images. But by forcing him to break the sacred image, you ironically affirm it, right? And that's the catastrophic revenge of the holy, right? Is that you ironically, as Pullman was saying, make everybody interested in the Last Supper. You ironically emphasize the importance of this imagery and teach people how to read symbols again.
Yeah. Well, as we transition towards the latter section of our conversation today, we've still got a few people watching live. So any viewers, if you've got questions or comments you want to send in, put those in on whatever platform you're viewing. They should show up on my end here. If I can, I'll read your comments, and then we'll try to address yours here in a moment. Annie, since you mentioned that hideous strength, I'll add one other piece in. And I'd love to get your thoughts on the Paris's loss of power after this moment, as in connection with that. One of my favorite scenes at the very end of the hideous strength comes at Lewis titles it "The Curse of Babel," where the whole book, in one sense, is about these scientists who deny reality. One of my favorite depictions of that is this guy named Withers. I suspect many of our listeners have worked for a person like Withers. Withers' expertise is heading an organization and not actually saying anything, no matter what question is asked. And he says nothing in lots of words. He's very good at saying nothing for a long, long time. But at this last scene, surrounded by all these people, there's a hall where they're all having dinner, like a fundraising dinner, end-of-year celebration dinner kind of thing. And these folks have all been involved in various ways in bringing nonsense and immorality into further existence in the world. And there's so many other pieces, and they're constantly denying reality. So much so that they have invited a demon to inhabit a severed head. It's just like Lewis was just having so much fun with it by this point. But the unexpected happens where these folks spend so much time denying the reality of the spiritual that the literal powers of heaven descend, and Mercury is at front and center in this scene, because Mercury gives them literally the curse of Babel, and they lose the ability to communicate with each other, and absolute chaos ensues. And then, of course, this is where Lewis is really just having fun. They have a menagerie of animals to torture for their experiments. So those animals get loose and eat the mad scientists. It's great. So with that, Annie, I want to set this up just a little bit. I already mentioned my favorite scene in the book of Daniel, where Belshazzar's blasphemy is answered by God. I'm still very Protestant and don't want to draw, and I'm still enough of a history major that I don't want to draw causal lines when it comes to what God is doing without God telling me that that's what he's doing. But I at least want to raise the question. It does not seem terribly accidental to me that this moment happens, and just a few hours later, the entire city of Paris has an electrical blackout where the only place that is still lit up on the Parisian skyline is the Cathedral Sacré-Cœur. It's the newest of the Parisian cathedrals. I was there back in September, and it's an active Catholic church. They had lots of people who were there for Mass, even though we tourists were trying not to be too distracting. So what do you make of this moment, or the correlation of these two events? Is there anything there? Is this just coincidence? Is this some sort of symbolic resonance? Is this God responding and turning out the lights? What's going on? What with Paris losing power right after this?
Yeah. I tweeted, symbolism happens, right? I mean, you elevate a diabolical image into the high place and the lights go out. That symbolism happens. Now, I heard someone, here's the problem with thinking symbolically, is that people then want to overinterpret everything. And that's not really how symbolism works, that symbols have kind of a rich polyvalency. Like, let's say a rose. Okay, you can't make a rose mean the same thing as an onion, but there's a rich fullness to the meanings embodied in a rose that can be used in a variety of ways, right? And so we do get, I think, some of what happened in the Middle Ages, or you can see some people do that makes people resistant to symbolism, is that they want to precisely define the meaning of every little thing. And I don't think that's how art works. I don't think that's how God's cosmic art works. That there is meaning, but that meaning is polyvalent, and it works at levels, if that makes sense. So I try not to overinterpret kind of precise little events in that way. But what I do think is the meaning is kind of obvious. Again, you elevate something dark into the highest places and the world goes dark. Did God orchestrate that meaning? I mean, I think, why not? Without, holding that rather loosely and just kind of phenomenologically, that's what we observed. And that's kind of the meaning that seemed to emerge from the event. And that's a sign, but not to attribute too much precise, meaning or make a big deal of it, if that makes sense. One comment I did hear was like, oh, well, we know the source of the light on the church, it had a generator. And what I just think about that comment is really funny. We know the cause, it was the generator, it wasn't God, right? That's kind of that classic failure to differentiate between levels of causality, right? Like God is the ultimate cause of all things, and he works through secondary causes, and not to confuse levels of causality, which, and it reminds me, where Lewis says, is it Voyage of the Dawn Treader? And Eustace says, well, I know what a star is in our world. Oh, it's a ball of gas. And, Corey Arkin, I think, says, that is what a star made of, but that's not what a star is. Okay, so maybe it's the generator that kept it alight, but that's not the meaning that emerged from the phenomenon that we saw.
I think that's a really helpful distinction. There's Richard Gamble trained me too well not to really despise conspiracy theories, but then we happen to live in a year where it seems like the conspiracy theories keep coming true. So I really want to say there's something very significant there. But my wife and I recently went to the Sight and Sound Theater up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and saw their staging of the Book of Daniel, which is a phenomenal play. Anybody wanting a good Bible play recommendation, it should be coming out on DVD in the next year, but definitely worth watching. But I walked away from that play thinking it is very significant. God does care about who the leaders are of nations, and he does care about things that happen on a grand stage. Now, he also cares about the individual person. He cares about the hairs on our head, and he does not want anyone to fall away. But he's also interested in that grand picture. And so I wonder if there is something significant about the scale at which that moment that we've been discussing today happens on. It's one thing if there's a I think of that there was I always get Iowa and Idaho confused. One of those two states had there was somebody who put a satanic altar up in the state house, and God bless the courageous man who went and just knocked it down. But as far as I'm aware, there was no like grand cosmic response to the erection of a satanic altar in a state house. And there were a lot of people who were like, yeah, religious liberty, maybe, what's going on? There's been a much bigger response to this tableau on an international global stage. And I just wonder if the scale is significant there.
I think that it is significant. And that's part of paying attention to hierarchy. We need to learn to pay attention to hierarchy. And that is why, you know, I've seen some people say, well, the French do this kind of art all the time. And there's mockeries of the Lord's Supper on the Simpsons. And, you know, context matters in that if I go to a postmodern art gallery in Berlin, you know, I expect to see the postmoderns do what the postmoderns do. And I have a choice whether or not to go to that. Or, you know, within a particular TV show, you know, you're going to the Simpkins. The Simpkins is satire, so you go to the Simpkins expecting satire, and maybe there's still offense at the satire going too far, but it's a TV show that's lower down on the attention hierarchy of our culture. The issue is that this happened at the highest place of attention that there is. I don't, you know, maybe someone name for me, but not, you know, there's no higher place of attention that we have as a globe. So that's what makes it significant. In addition to the fact, again, of thinking in terms of purpose, what was the purpose of that place of attention? And then how was that purpose subverted?
I think those are all really helpful things to think about. I want to save, we've got a friend from Kelly Burton put a comment in that I want to come back to at the very end. Let me try this. It should show up on the screen there. We'll come back to this at the end of our conversation. That's the same kind of question I wanted to end with. So Kelly, thanks for sending this in. But we'll come back to the question of where do we as a civilization go from here as we wrap up in a few minutes. For our last kind of segment, I want to walk through a series of responses I've seen and topics we had. I know you mentioned you wanted to get to Philip Reef and the death works idea in here, so we need to get that in. One thing we both hinted at but not really talked about is the desire people have to disconnect this tableau from the Last Supper, and therefore suggesting that Christians are massively overreacting. As I understand it, there was a gentleman named Jan Bilger who made a painting about 100 years after Da Vinci called The Feast of the Gods. And if my intern is on his game, he will now put up a picture of the Feast of the Gods. Hopefully that cue was good enough for him in editing. If not, I'll be sure to rib him about that. Be that as it may, the Feast of the Gods is clearly very similar. It too has a table. It's set in the heavens, and it's got a bunch of naked people and men and women and servants and angels, and it's clearly inspired by the Greco-Roman mythological world. Annie, do you see any plausible connection between this and the myth of the gods? Does that actually matter? Why are people wanting to run to that painting instead of the Last Supper? What are your thoughts here?
You know, I haven't researched this in terms of, you know, tracking if artists have cited it as an influence or not. You know, kind of like we said a little bit earlier, to me, it's all completely irrelevant because the meaning is in the things themselves and they echo across various works of art. But, you know, I did quickly look up that painting, The Supper of the Gods, and at least my quick research said that artist intentionally imitated Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. So there's already, if you want to track artistic influence, the influence is there. And, you know, and again, you know, I teach literature. This is how art works. You know, everybody's referring to Homer all the time, right? And so that the layers of meaning build up as artists are influenced by one another. So to me, it's largely irrelevant in terms of what the tableau was communicating meaning-wise. You know, the other thing that I think is just important to point out, and we'll bring in our friend Lewis here, is that yes, the Dionysian feast in some ways foreshadowed the Eucharist, right? And because, Lewis talks about how the myths were good dreams and that they had certain truths in them. And that is how general revelation works, that God created the world with meanings. Those meanings are present for everyone to see. The pagans, through their own observation of the world and life and stories, are going to reflect those truths that are in the world, and they are going to precursor Christ, because Jesus Christ and the Christ story is the place where all meaning meets, right? Paul tells us that Jesus Christ is the one through whom all things were created, in whom all things hold together. All the meanings, the various threads of truth that we're going to find in all the parts of the world are going to be gathered together in the Christ story. And so, yeah, there'd be echoes of, Christ in the Dionysus story. But at this point in our culture, we are a post-Christian culture, right? And we could no longer have the innocent naivety of a pagan any more than a married woman can again have the innocent naivety of a virgin. To return to Dionysus, to return to the pagan gods, is a rejection of Christ. We have known him. We have seen him. We have beheld him. We have served him. We have worshiped him. And to do anything else is a rejection. And there cannot be a kind of, a wholesome return. We're not going to. So, pre-Christ, you might get some truth out of Dionysus. Post-Christ, your only option, the only way to return to Dionysus is a diabolical return.
I think that's a great way to look at it. I love that idea. Like, we're a post-Christian nation, we can't go back to that original position of some level of innocence and naivete. The part that has just struck me, it's just so interesting. I had lunch with a friend on Sunday, and then I had a bunch of friends on Facebook commenting about this. So those of you, if you're listening to it, you'll probably know who you are. But they are just not at all willing to accept the reality that this could be a really pernicious attack on Christianity, and that if there is an attack, that it's a legitimate thing for Christians to, at the very least, I'm not at all advocating somehow like take up your sword, Christian. Like, Jesus clearly told Peter, put away your sword. This is not the time. Don't cut off Malchus's ear. Like, that's not what you're supposed to do. But it is perfectly legitimate for us to look at this and say, no, that's an attack on Christianity, and it's an affirmation of evil. And to the extent that our society affirms evil, we do, in fact, invite God's judgment, because God is not mocked. He will punish evil now or in eternity. So it is better for us as a society to name evil as evil and good good. And when we confuse those categories, ultimately, people suffer. And so I at least see in the attempt to go towards the Feast of the Gods as either a very just misguided reading of only a few articles that quickly tried to come up with a new source, or maybe a little worse, just an unwillingness to recognize that no, we Christians are now the cultural minority, and we are being assaulted by the now majority world. And I'm just going to reference Aaron Wren again. Like, we have to change our strategy. We have to be aware that we are that minority culture. Let me rattle off a couple other responses I saw, and then I want to give you the last word on this question in terms of like where this fits as a kind of death work, because I think that could be a really helpful observation. You mentioned this line I wanted to work in earlier. This piece strikes me as being very evident of Foucault's France and not St. Louis or Saint-Denis' France. My wife and I had a chance to go visit Paris for 5 days this past September, and I loved it. Paris is gorgeous. It's a wonderful city. The best wine. I ordered beef tartare and had no idea what I was getting, and it was delicious. So love Paris. I was struck everywhere we went in the city about the absolute break at the French Revolution. I took a deep dive primary source course in college on the French Revolution. Like, I knew cognitively that the revolution was a break from the Ancien regime in modern France. Everywhere we went, there was just every historical site had this break point. It's like, oh, here's what this was like before 1789. Here's what's happened after 1815. And it's just been that break point. Well, this hit me came to a head when we visited the Cathedral of Saint Denis, which has it has the royal crypt of the royal family of France. That was there, which was also I was found fascinating. It was unearthed, and all the bones were distributed during the Revolution, and then they were thrown back into a common grave after the Revolution. But while we were walking there, we passed the Square de Michel Foucault. It's there right off of one of the campuses of the University of Paris. It's not huge. It's just but it's a I don't know, probably 10 by 20 square foot plot of land with a fence and a historical marker sign. This is the Place de la Michel Foucault. And that struck me as significant because Foucault was a rock star academic in a way that's hard, I think, for us to imagine today. Like I can't imagine an actual sitting obtuse professor who can barely be understood reading his lectures to a packed auditorium of hundreds, if not thousands, of graduate students. But that was Foucault in the 70s. And he inaugurated this view of all of life, not really inaugurated, but he propagated big time this view that all of life is power structures and power struggles, and you must free yourself. And he did exactly as you said. He thought sex was a primary locus of where that fight for liberation was going to happen. At this moment, I think, now, I've not seen anybody else say this, so this could just be me, but this just seemed to really, like, lest there be no confusion, modern day France is Michel Foucault's France. It is not the France of Saint Louis, who built Saint-Chapelle. This is not the France of the Loire Valley. This is not the France of Montmichel or anything like that. This is Michel Foucault's France. Bishop Barron did a couple of videos that I thought really resonated with people. They went really far. And he really did not see the Olympic Committee's apology note as being worth anything. I appreciated his just kind of being willing to call them out on that. Last thing I want to say about this is that when I was prepping for this, I was struck by the initial layout of the Tableau table as being sort of blank, but then the blue Baccus is brought and is displayed and everything. The replacement of the feast on Da Vinci's, because Da Vinci's Last Supper has like just a normal feast, without knowing that it was the Last Supper and that Jesus is going to do the Lord's Supper. You wouldn't necessarily look at it and think, oh, wow, what a great Jewish Passover. It's not that kind of portrayal. It's a very Italian traditional feast kind of setup. But I thought it was interesting that you're replacing Christ with Dionysus. And this struck me as a movement beyond paganism. That like G.K. Chesterton, in his book, The Everlasting Man, he talks about he contrasts the devouring gods of Carthage with the kindly gods of Greece and Rome. And he thinks that the Western world received a little bit of unexpected grace by receiving these kindly gods as their mythological beings. And so, but it seems that now we're going beyond that. We're going beyond, this Dionysus is not a Dionysus within the natural order. This is a Dionysus who calls his junk a revolver. like there's something very deadly and devouring in this depiction. And this is what we're invited to feast on. Like this is there. So all that said, I think I agree with you. Like there's no going back to the kindly paganism that William Wordsworth talked about in that great poem of he'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn and see Triton rise with his wreathed horn. We can't go back. Whatever we're going to next is really something different. Yeah. Now, Anna, you told me you wanted to make sure to get in the idea of the death works. Where does walk us through what a death work is, and I got to give Bill Batchelder a quick shout out here since he's at least who introduced me to Philip Reef and the death works. But what is a death work, and does this moment fit as a death work for our culture?
Yeah, I think death works have become so common in artistic circles that it's almost a commonplace. So a death work, that's a term, as you say, Philip Reef defined in Triumph of the Therapeutic. And what he is tracing is in our cultural development, once we rejected belief in God and belief in the transcendent, I mean, that was traditionally the role that art played, right? To elevate our attention towards what is transcendently good and true and beautiful. And once we no longer believe in the transcendent and we've collapsed within that immanent frame, to use Charles Taylor's, right? Then what is it that our art does? And the death work is basically, all we can do, no longer believing in truth, all we can do is play around with deconstructing truth. So death works are artistic works that take old traditional symbols of transcendent truth and subvert them. And it's just become what so much of our art is. And I think that's part of why you hear people talk about, why aren't there good movies? Well, in order to make good art, you have to believe in a transcendent truth, that the art is reflecting. And having lost that for the most part, we're just rehashing the same stories in different directive ways to tell different, identity politic grievances. And so that's what a death work is. It's a work of art that takes an old symbol of truth and subverts it, disrupts it, deconstructs it. And of course, that's what, this is a death work exemplar, par excellence, is exactly what the Olympic opening ceremonies are. And I think, as we said before, people just intuitively picked up on that because of the density of the death work, right? The density of symbols that were being subverted. One last point I would like to just make to help, again, why does it matter? The French are going to be the French. And just to recognize that humans are mimetic. We are made in the image of God. That is our nature. Made in the image of God, what it means is we are created to imitate, to reflect. It is deep, deep in our nature, as Rene Girard talks about in all of his work, which is very important. So we are deeply imitative, and we are made to look at that which is raised up in the high place and imitate it. That's why it matters. When we raise up images of perversity and evil and death works in the high places, human nature, it's our automatic response to look at that and to imitate it. And if we're imitating that which is deconstructive, sacrilegious, as we imitate that in our own life, it will bring destruction, despair, it will bring harm. And that's why it matters. I care about this. I'm offering a criticism, again, not personally offended, because I care about the well-being of others, because I care about the common good, because I know that if we want people to flourish and to have true happiness, we need to elevate what is good and true and beautiful into our high places. So I feel like I really want to note that, because I know so many people are just fussing and finger wagging at Christians for caring, and I want to try to help articulate why it really does matter. And it's not just about, pearl clutching and offense.
Well, you're certainly not alone in that. I would agree with everything you just said, but I want to add in one other voice. This is from an article by a gentleman named Hayden Daniel. Here's how he introduced his article. The opening ceremony of the Summer Olympic Games provides the opportunity for the host country to revel in a sense of national pride and celebrate its unique history and traditions. Any jokes about cowardice or cheese loving aside, France undeniably occupies a position as one of the pillars of Western civilization, with monumental contributions to literature, art, and science. Drawing upon a rich history and culture, it had the chance to show the world a vibrant and resilient nation ready to thrive in the 21st century, especially after a chaotic election earlier in July. Instead, France decided to showcase the gender madness and degeneracy that are slowly but surely eroding the West. Nothing about how this ceremony was choreographed was an accident. The organizers made the deliberate choice to include transgender performers, to include a child in the midst of those hypersexualized performers, and to blatantly mock Christianity, all in lieu of actually honoring their homeland. How one's nation is represented on the world stage is a choice, just as decline is a choice. I think that's a key thing to keep in mind, that the decline is in fact a choice. And the hope and the danger of the choice is that the danger is that the choice is being made every day. But therein lies our hope as well, because the choice could be made differently. We could make a change And with that, because this is the optimistic curmudgeon, we always try to end on a hopeful note. I want to go back to Kelly Fitzsimmons Burton's question: where do we as a civilization go from here? Annie, what are your thoughts? Where do we go from here? Are we stuck in despair, or are there still sources of hope that we can point to?
Yeah, never, right? And that hope is that this is God's world, and he has created it with goodness and truth and beauty and meaning that pours forth, again, as the psalmist says, day unto day, night unto night. There is no speech or tongue where their voice is not heard. That the world is full of meaning that God has given it, and we only need to begin to pay attention again. And I think that renewal has already happened. This conversation is an example. All the conversations I have about learning to read symbolism again, to learn to read the meaning of the world so that we can then reflect that goodness, truth, and beauty, that meaning in our own lives. So the hope is God has created the meaning of the world. He is not mocked. That meaning will come through, and it cannot be overcome or fully destroyed. And I think, how do we build on that hopeful truth? We simply look for ways that we can, within our own spheres of influence, elevate what is good and true and beautiful into high places for people to imitate. And I, to bring in C.S. Lewis just one more time and the abolition of man, in the abolition of man, he says it all starts with the disruption of the chest. So he imagines the chest as the training of right responses that begins with the education of children, that we teach children to love beautiful art and to love the beauty of nature. And we teach children to be repulsed by what is gross or bad. And the training of those affective responses, the training of the affection, is what will give us the strength to choose good when it's hard, right? We will have so trained our affections to love what is good that we will pursue the good even when it's hard. And that, these death works rip out the chest, right? And train us to ignore evil. And so where we go from there is to renew that work of training the affections in our children, in our churches, in our own hearts, right? So that our own praise and delight in what is good and true will overflow in our conversations, in our work, in whatever sphere of work we've given. And that will be the way that in our own spheres of influence, we participate in that renewal. And then hopefully that will scale up, right? Hopefully as Christians begin making better art, better culture, their joy in genuine feasting overflows, we will be able to do that work on higher and higher levels that will offer, higher and higher levels of renewal. So that's the way that I see a hopeful future unfolding from here.
No, I love that. And I think you and I are both involved in the classical education renewal movement. That is, I think, at its core, the answer to Kelly's question. It's a very practical way of thinking about, well, where do we go from here? We've really got to restore the foundations. We've got to recover the sources of meaning. And we do that by going to the same places that all the generations before us have gone. The cry of the Renaissance humanists, ad fontes, is still our cry. We too are going back to the sources. We are trying to figure out where is truth, goodness, and beauty. We're walking through Athens with Socrates. We're voyaging with Aeneas, searching for home. We're pilgrimaging with Dante, down and up, and trying to figure out how do we get to the ultimate rose, and so on. All of those things are what classical education is really all about. And in as much as I think it's always worth keeping in mind, like these kinds of moments, in one sense, they're very significant. In the other, at the same time, they happen so frequently. We could have had this conversation about maybe perhaps 100 different moments over the last 10 years that have happened. This one just happened to spark both of us within the same week. I think it's always worth keeping in mind, it's taken at least 80 years by a very conservative estimate for Western civilization to get down to this point. that we could celebrate the ideas of self-indulgent, gluttony, and sex as our unifying features. That didn't happen overnight. It will take at least 4 generations to recover. And there will always, we know that the church will endure. We know there will always be a remnant. We're not guaranteed that Western civilization will actually make it into eternity, except in as much as Western civ is part of the church that God is renewing. But I think with the daily work of reading, talking, thinking, seeking to live the good life in our own small circles and bring that to as many people as possible, while learning constantly to call what is good, good, and to call what is evil, evil. The more we can do of that, the more we push back against these forces of modernity. Well, Annie, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a wonderful conversation. I've really enjoyed learning a lot more about symbolism from what you've been sharing.
It's been great, Josh. So glad to see you.
Yeah, just in case anybody listening to us wants to know more about where to go to find out more about symbolism and interpreting symbolic meaning, we've mentioned Jonathan Pageau's podcast, The Symbolic World. You've mentioned his brother's book, The Language of Creation. Any other sources that you think people should check out if they really want to get deeper into recovering this language of symbolism?
Yeah, I can't think of a better source than Jonathan Pageau's Symbolic World podcast, his videos. Go work through those videos. He does a fantastic job taking, especially his earlier videos. Go to videos maybe 2, 3, 4 years older. He'll take a particular cultural artifact, a movie or a meme, and really, like we did with this blue Baccus image, break it down for you. And his work is really helpful. I think Bishop Barron his videos are very helpful. And if anyone wants to go to my website, anniecrawford.net, I have a variety of articles there where I try to unpack the sacramental view and help walk through some movies and that kind of stuff as well. Most of those are at An Unexpected Journal, a journal of cultural apologetics, and a lot of the articles and authors are trying to do the same thing over there.
Wonderful. Well, Annie, thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you, listeners and viewers, for joining us here on The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest has been Annie Crawford. We do both maintain hope for the West. Our hope is not found in either Olympic triumph or in despair, but in the radical work of God to regain humanity for himself. Until next time, seek the good, love the true, and enjoy the beautiful.